Okay, let's dive in. We're tackling something, well, something pretty fundamental today, aren't we? This whole idea of calling someone bad.
Yeah, it's a label that gets thrown around a lot. Feels almost primal, but also really complicated when you start picking it apart.
Exactly. And you've given us this really fascinating collection of sources, notes, thoughts, different ways of looking at it all, trying to get grips with this exact question.
It feels very grounded in trying to understand people, especially when their actions are hurtful or confusing. It's not just theoretical.
Right. So our mission here for you is to unpack these sources you shared. We want to understand, how do we define badness? Why are we so quick to use that word? And importantly, are there maybe better ways to think about people and what they do?
Better or maybe just more useful ways. More accurate, perhaps.
Yeah, more accurate. So your sources are leading the way on this one.
Okay, I'm ready. Where do we start?
Well, the sources kick off right with that basic human impulse that needs sometimes to just label someone bad.
Yeah.
Why do we do that? What's the pull?
The sources point to a few key things. A big one is simply reacting to being hurt or feeling threatened. It's almost visceral.
Makes sense. A defense mechanism.
Sort of.
Yeah.
And there's also the tribalism aspect, drawing a clear line. Us versus them, good guys, bad guys.
Right. Creates order.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes, honestly, the world feels chaotic, morally gray. Slapping a bad label on someone can feel like bringing some kind of simple clarity, even if it's, well, false clarity. We kind of crave those easy answers.
That neat dividing line. But almost immediately, your sources argue against that simplicity. They really emphasize that people aren't static things.
Precisely. That's a core theme. Behavior isn't just about who someone is. It's hugely shaped by context, by their situation, maybe even just, a really terrible day.
And morality isn't like a light switch on or off.
Not at all. It's much more of a spectrum, right?
No.
Someone can be struggling, maybe acting poorly in one part of their life, but trying really hard or doing well in another. It's messy.
So how do the sources suggest we actually categorize badness when we do use the term? They talk about different lenses or categories.
They do, yeah. It's not about making a definitive list, but recognizing we judge based on different things, like was the harm intentional? That's the moral badness. Or even evil category. Think, cruelty, manipulation.
Okay. Intent matters.
Hugely. Then there are things we see as character flaws, selfishness, arrogance, dishonesty. But the sources caution these often stem from deeper issues, like insecurity or trauma, not necessarily pure malice.
Ah, so the root might be different even if the behavior is difficult. What else?
There's simple incompetence, causing harm not out of badness, but lack of skill or effort, or maybe being overwhelmed. Think like a negligent parent who's just completely out of their depth. Is that bad or just unprepared?
That's a tricky one.
It is. Then you have social transgressions, breaking norms, being rude, violating taboos. This one's heavily cultural, of course. What's rude in one place is normal in another.
And the sources warn that can mask bias too, right? Calling something bad just because it's different.
Exactly. And finally, they mention things like unreliability or betrayal, breaking trust. Ghosting someone, cheating, constantly flaking out. The emotional harm is real, definitely. But does it make someone a bad person inherently, or just a flawed one who messed up?
So multiple lenses, and they can overlap too. Someone could be incompetent and unreliable.
Oh, absolutely. It's rarely just one thing.
Which leads us right into that huge question your sources grapple with. Can we even say someone is objectively bad? Is there such a thing?
Well, if you look at it psychologically, the sources make a really strong point. Almost nobody sees themselves as the villain of their own story.
Right, we all have our reasons.
We rationalize, we justify. Even people who engage in what we call dark behaviors often operate from a place of their own pain or perceived deficits or feeling alienated. It's rarely that sort of mustache-twirling, I am evil internal monologue.
Okay, so psychologically it's complex. What about philosophically? Do the sources bring in any ethical frameworks?
Yeah, they briefly touch on a few, like Aristotle talking about eudaimonia or human flourishing, Kant's idea about never treating people merely as a means to an end, or utilitarianism focusing on overall harm versus good.
Are those helpful?
They offer valuable ways to analyze actions, definitely. But the sources also note they're still based on adopting a particular ethical system, and there's no single system everyone agrees on. So objective badness is still really elusive.
So where do the sources land for like a working definition, just so we can keep talking about it?
They propose something practical. Someone who persistently causes harm to others, knowingly or negligently, with little to no regard for the impact.
Okay, persistently. That feels like the key word there.
It really is. It's the difference between a mistake, even a big one, or a bad patch, and a consistent pattern of causing harm. And, importantly, it focuses on behavior, not innate being.
Which means there's room for change.
Exactly. It leaves the door open for growth, accountability, even redemption, because it's describing what someone does repeatedly, not who they are irrevocably.
And this focus on patterns really underlines why that simple good versus bad label just doesn't work, according to these sources.
Yeah, it fails in several ways. First, it's just blunt. It flattens people who are incredibly complex into these flat, easy-to-dismiss caricatures.
And a cartoon villain.
Right. And paradoxically, it could actually reduce accountability. If you tell someone they are bad, like it's their core nature, well, why should they bother trying to act differently? It suggests they can't change anyway.
I hadn't thought of it that way. It lets them off the hook, almost.
In a weird way, yes.
Yeah.
And maybe the most uncomfortable point the sources raise is how it can fuel our own sense of righteousness. Calling them bad makes us feel good and helps us avoid looking at our own messy parts, our own inconsistencies.
Oof. Yeah. So instead of just labeling, what questions do the sources suggest we ask?
Much more specific probing questions like,
Yeah.
what exactly was the harm done here? What seems to have been the intention? And what was the actual impact, regardless of intent?
Right.
What were the circumstances surrounding this? Is this person capable of seeing the harm, of reflecting? Is change possible? Are they perhaps a product of really difficult circumstances themselves?
Those questions shift everything, from a verdict to an investigation almost.
Exactly. An investigation aimed at understanding, even if the behavior itself is unacceptable.
And this leads into another idea from your sources, thinking about people less as fixed points and more as moving along different axes of development.
The idea that badness, if we use the term, isn't a permanent identity. It might be more like a state someone is in currently. It could be temporary, conditional, maybe even changeable.
Like different aspects of being human are on a spectrum.
Yeah, precisely. The sources float ideas like axes for moral awareness, moving from sort of ignorant or oblivious towards being reflective, or empathy from being numb or callous towards being compassionate.
What else? Accountability.
Accountability. Yeah, moving from deflecting blame towards taking proactive responsibility. And maybe a growth orientation, seeing yourself as fixed versus capable of transformation.
So someone could be, say, high on empathy, but really low on accountability.
Absolutely. Or highly self-aware, but maybe lacking in empathy sometimes. People are complex mixes, not just good or bad across the board. They're works in progress.
That makes a lot more sense. Now, building on this spectrum idea, your sources introduce a really interesting model, the moral compass. And it doesn't just contrast good and bad, but it brings in average.
Which is crucial, right? Because let's face it, most people, most of the time, probably land somewhere in that average zone.
So how do the sources describe this average state?
Often as inconsistent, maybe unaware of their full impact, sometimes passive when action might be needed. It's not usually about active malice, like the bad category, but it's also not consistently striving for the good or ethical choice. It's more driven by comfort, convenience, or maybe just not thinking things through.
Okay, and the sources suggest looking at this good versus average versus bad across different life areas.
Yes, they break it down into tiers. Let's take the first one. Ethical character. This is about inner stuff, intent, self-awareness, integrity, taking responsibility.
How does average differ from bad here?
Okay, so average intent might often be self-interest or avoiding discomfort, which can lead to accidentally harming others. Bad intent, though, is more often about actually wanting to harm or dominate, or just being callously indifferent to the harm caused.
And the response when called out.
That's a huge differentiator. Average might get defensive, make excuses, but might eventually reflect, maybe apologize genuinely. Bad tends to deny, deflect, shift blame entirely, maybe even gaslight the person who was harmed. There's little to no genuine accountability.
Got it. What's the next tier?
Relational integrity. How we are in relationships with others. Empathy, support, communication, respecting boundaries.
Okay, average versus bad in relationships.
Average empathy might be selected, like they're empathetic to their friends but not strangers. Or maybe they struggle setting or respecting boundaries consistently. They might avoid conflict rather than communicate clearly. Bad empathy is often non-existent, dismissive, or even cruel. They might actively violate boundaries for control. Support isn't just inconsistent. They might actually take advantage of vulnerability or undermine the other person. Communication can be harsh, manipulative, or controlling. The core pattern is about eroding the other person's sense of self-worth or safety.
That sounds pretty damaging.
It is. And the third tier scales up to our role in the wider world, the civic or collective role. How we engage with justice, community, power, privilege, truthfulness in public life.
How does average play out here compared to bad?
The average person might be largely passive about systemic injustice, may be unaware of their own privilege or how they benefit from unfair systems. They might do the minimum required civically. Maybe they share misinformation unintentionally because they didn't check.
Okay, kind of neutral or unaware.
Right. Whereas the bad actor in this sphere actively reinforces injustice, abuses power for personal gain, consciously exploits their privilege, deliberately distorts truth to manipulate public opinion, or works to undermine systems that promote fairness or democracy.
So it's the difference between being part of the problem passively versus actively creating or worsening the problem for selfish reasons.
Exactly. Apathy versus active sabotage, in a way.
These tiers really clarify the patterns we're talking about beyond just single actions, and it reinforces that idea from the sources about why people might act badly. It's not always the same driver.
Right. The sources mention different potential routes for bad behavior. Outright malice, wanting to cause pain. Neglect, a profound lack of care about the harm they cause. Cowardice, maybe avoiding doing the right thing out of fear. And arrogance, believing the rules simply don't apply to them.
And average behavior, in contrast, is often more about prioritizing their own comfort zone or ego.
Yeah, avoiding the hard ethical questions or actions because it's easier not to. Less about intent to harm, more about self-preservation or convenience taking precedence.
The sources use some concrete examples to make this average versus bad distinction clearer in everyday situations. Can we look at a couple, like at work?
Sure. The example given is, an average mistake might be forgetting to send an important email because you're disorganized, you feel bad, apologize, try to fix it. A bad action might be intentionally leaving someone off that email to undermine them competitively and then lying about it or blaming the technology when confronted.
Same outcome, initially missed email, but totally different intent and follow-up.
Completely. Or think about parenting styles.
Okay.
An average parent might yell when stressed or overwhelmed, feel guilty afterward, apologize, and maybe try to learn better coping skills. A bad pattern might involve regularly belittling, shaming, or emotionally abusing a child to maintain dominance, and then justifying it or denying it's harmful.
Wow. Yeah. One is a lapse under pressure. The other is a harmful pattern of relating.
Precisely. Or in friendships. An average friend might pull back or be awkward because they're dealing with their own stuff, maybe feel bad they haven't reached out, but struggle to reconnect.
We've all been there, probably.
Right. A bad friend, though, might deliberately share your secrets to gain social status or use your vulnerabilities against you when you disagree, and then gaslight you if you call them out. One is about struggling with connection. The other is actively weaponizing it.
That's a chilling distinction, and it scales up, doesn't it, when people or institutions have more power?
Absolutely. The sources spend significant time on this macro-level badness because the impact is so much greater.
Like in the media, for instance.
Yeah. They contrast, say, average media practices, maybe sensationalizing stories for clicks due to systemic pressures, but still issuing corrections when errors are proven, with bad actors who deliberately create and spread disinformation to sow division or manipulate opinion for political or financial gain, and who aggressively defend the lies, even when exposed.
The impact difference there is huge. One might annoy or mislead temporarily. The other can poison the whole information ecosystem.
Exactly. Undermine trust, polarize society. The sources suggest a key test is the primary goal to inform, however imperfectly, or to manipulate.
What about in business?
Similar distinction. An average company might prioritize profits and maybe lag on ethical practices or environmental standards, perhaps due to market pressures or just not being proactive. Still needs accountability, but might respond to regulation or public pressure.
Okay. And a bad corporate actor.
That's one that intentionally exploits labor, knowingly hides or lies about environmental damage, actively lobbies against public safety regulations, or engages in massive fraud, all while knowing the harm it causes, purely for maximizing profit or power. The key test becomes, are they trying to wield power responsibly, even if imperfectly, or are they intentionally externalizing harm onto society?
That difference in intent and knowledge seems critical.
Yeah.
Politics.
Oh, definitely. Average politics might involve campaigning on safe issues, making necessary but maybe uninspiring compromises, perhaps with decent intentions, even if the outcomes are flawed.
And the bad end of the spectrum.
That involves deliberately lying to the public, scapegoating vulnerable groups, enacting policies known to cause widespread harm purely for political gain, undermining democratic processes, or even inciting violence. The impact here can be devastating, affecting millions of lives and eroding the foundations of society. The test: are they trying to serve the public interest or just accumulate personal power?
It's sobering how these patterns play out on a larger scale. The sources also mention online influencers, tech, even art.
Yeah, same dynamic applies. Is an influencer just promoting unrealistic standards, maybe thoughtlessly, average, or are they consciously encouraging harmful trends, exploiting followers' trust, or engaging in targeted bullying for clicks and profit? Bad.
Is a tech company overlooking ethical side effects while chasing efficiency? Average. Or are they building tools designed to addict or manipulate users, dismissing safety concerns and hoarding power? Bad.
Right. Is art exploring difficult themes clumsily? Average. Or is it actively glorifying abuse, spreading bigotry, or silencing criticism to protect powerful figures? Bad. In each case, the sources push us to look at the scale of impact, the degree of intentionality versus negligence, and crucially, how they respond when concerns are raised. Do they engage, dismiss, or attack?
This really paints a picture where badness isn't just about individual meanness, but about patterns, awareness, impact, and responsibility, especially when power is involved.
Exactly. And interestingly, the sources then pivot. After all this analysis of judging others, they turn the lens inward. They suggest that our tendency towards harsh judgment both of others and ourselves often stems from our own stuff.
Like what?
Cognitive distortions, those mental traps our brains fall into, emotional dysregulation, reacting intensely because we're overwhelmed, or even unmet needs, feeling insecure, so we project negativity outwards or inwards.
Okay, so what do the sources suggest we do about it? Starting with ourselves, that inner critic.
They offer some really practical strategies. One is trying to reframe that negative self-talk. Sometimes even using the third person, like asking, "Why is your name feeling this way?" can create helpful distance.
Interesting, like stepping outside the feeling for a moment.
Yeah. Another is consciously challenging those cognitive distortions the sources mention, like all or nothing thinking, "I failed, so I'm a failure," or mind reading, "They definitely think I'm stupid," or catastrophizing, "This mistake will ruin everything." The counter is to ask, okay, what's the actual evidence for this thought? Is there another way to see it?
Like applying critical thinking to our own automatic thoughts.
Exactly. And a big one is practicing self-compassion, which isn't about letting yourself off the hook. It's based on Kristen Neff's work. Acknowledging this is a moment of struggle, mindfulness, recognizing that everyone struggles and makes mistakes, common humanity, and trying to offer yourself the same kindness you might offer a friend, self-kindness.
Why is that helpful?
Because, the sources argue, beating yourself up rarely leads to constructive change. It often leads to shame and hiding. Self-compassion provides the emotional safety needed to actually look honestly at your mistakes and figure out how to do better. It fuels growth, not paralysis.
Okay, that makes sense. Be kind to yourself so you can be accountable.
Right. And anchoring in who you are becoming, not just who you were yesterday, focusing on your capacity for growth.
And what about judging others? How do the sources suggest we dial back the snap judgments?
Similar practical techniques. One is the 3-second delay. Before you mentally label someone idiot or jerk for cutting you off in traffic or saying something clumsy, just pause. 3 seconds. It interrupts the automatic judgment and creates a tiny space for curiosity.
Just a pause. Simple, but maybe effective.
Could be. Another is asking, what might be the backstory here? Is this person rushed, stressed, in pain, dealing with something I know nothing about? It shifts focus from their action to their potential circumstances or inner state. Doesn't excuse bad behavior, but it humanizes.
Yeah, adds context.
And a really powerful one the sources suggest. Reflect on a time you acted similarly. When were you inconsiderate or defensive or oblivious? What understanding or grace did you wish others had offered you then? Applying that perspective can instantly shift judgment towards, well, maybe not kinship, but at least recognition of shared human imperfection.
Ouch. Yeah, that hits home, turning judgment into self-reflection.
And focusing on observing behavior, they raise their voice, rather than assigning character, they're an angry person.
Yeah.
Is this a consistent pattern, or was this maybe unusual for them?
So observe, don't label immediately.
And crucially, the sources stress. This isn't about excusing harmful behavior. It's about separating accountability from contempt. You can still set firm boundaries, call out harm, demand change, but without needing to dehumanize the person doing it. Clarity about the behavior, not contempt for the person.
That's a vital distinction. Maintain standards without resorting to hatred or dismissal.
Exactly.
Your sources don't stop there, though. They add even more layers of complexity near the end.
They do. It's like saying, okay, you think you've got it, here's some more nuance, like the shadow of goodness.
What's that?
The idea that sometimes people acting good can be problematic too.
Yeah.
Like being performatively good for ego boosts, or acting like a martyr, or being so conflict avoidant and nice that they actually enable bad behavior in others. It questions the authenticity behind the facade of goodness.
Ah, so goodness can have its own pitfalls if it's not genuine or self-aware.
Right. They also touch on complex systems, how large-scale harm can happen almost unintentionally through the way systems are set up, making individual accountability really fuzzy. Who's bad when a disaster results from layers of small oversights and diffused responsibility?
So it's a huge challenge in the modern world.
And moral luck. How much are we judged for outcomes versus intentions, especially when chance plays a role? The drunk driver example is classic: one hits someone, one doesn't. Same bad decision, wildly different outcomes and judgments. How much grace do we extend for luck without excusing the initial bad choice? And the cycle of harm, the really difficult truth that people who experience harm, especially in childhood, are statistically more likely to perpetuate harm later. It doesn't remove responsibility, but it forces us to ask different questions about justice, healing, and prevention.
It adds so much context to why people might behave the way they do.
It does. And even the usefulness of the bad label itself is questioned. Sometimes maybe calling something bad is necessary for setting boundaries, for mobilizing against injustice, for coping. The key is distinguishing between recognizing a harmful pattern and freezing someone into a static, permanent identity.
So it's a tool, maybe, but a dangerous one if overused or used inaccurately.
Precisely. All these complexities just hammer home that final point from the sources, the myth of final judgment. People are not static. They evolve, they change, they regress, they learn. They're like that quote you found.
Unresolved stories in motion.
Exactly.
And that includes us, and so am I. Wow. This deep dive, really guided by your source materials, has taken us from that simple, instinctive, that person is bad, to, well, a much richer, more complicated, and maybe ultimately more useful place. It challenges the binary, explores the why behind the label, and offers tools for thinking with more nuance, more compassion, but also still with accountability.
It certainly moves beyond easy answers.
It really does. It circles back to that reflection. Most people are not good or bad. They are unresolved stories in motion. And so am I. It feels like a good place to pause.
A very human place to pause.
And it leaves us and leaves you listening with that final, really provocative question your sources posed. What would morality look like if it weren't about labeling people at all, but about co-creating ethical atmospheres where the conditions for goodness are more likely to emerge?
That's a question to sit with for a while.
Yeah.
Shifting from judging individuals to cultivating environments.
A huge shift. Okay, that wraps up this particular exploration into your sources on the complex idea of bad people. We really hope it's given you some valuable frameworks and maybe some challenging questions to ponder.